Now we go into the last system that Lawrence defines in his book, and that's going to be the declining bipolar arms trade system. Now, as far as boundaries and environments go, this system runs roughly from 1980 to 1992. Another important factor that Lawrence finds is that the steady decline of the bipolar political system meant that few arms deals were based on the East West rivalry. So, even during the last period, we talk about much of the arms exports not really having to do too much with the East-West rivalry. When we get into this time period, it almost all goes out the window. We almost go back into this post-war World War One type of laissez-faire system in which arms transfers and arms themselves are being seen as more of a commercial commodity than they are anything else. Which, again, just like the post World War One era, it becomes problematic, and we'll see that in just a few slides here. Um, what Lawrence also finds is that centrally controlled economies are discredited. Remember, this is when a lot of your Soviet bloc is beginning to kind of break up or really have issues. So you're seeing this controlled economy essentially being discredited, and they're taking on more of a laissez-faire free market type of view when it comes to arms transfers, especially to be able to make some of that money back. The suppliers are still going to continue to be major powers, and this is also because we're entering into a period in which arms which are um, in demand are going to be more high tech and incredibly expensive, right? We're getting into missile systems, we're getting into more advanced jets. We're getting into systems which are just expensive to produce. Therefore, you're seeing kind of this drop off when we saw in the 70s of a lot of these developing nations at least being able to produce small arms and tanks and things like that. Those are beginning to drop off because now your tanks are not just tanks, right? They're becoming computers on wheels. They're becoming more advanced to produce. So the suppliers are kind of going back to more of this major power dominated supply chain. So, what does Lawrence say about the characterization of the units within this period of time? Well, Lawrence points out that private national and multinational firms gain enough independence from national control to become major actors within the system. During this period of time, your private manufacturers within a state are really trying to tell the state that, look, if I don't export, I don't make money. And if I don't make money, I can't keep employment up. So these private firms are gaining more and more power within their own constrained domestic national system to where they now can go market out themselves. So you're seeing an increased power moving from the state essentially making the determination of who gets arms to the firms actually going out and marketing and beginning to make some of those decisions and an impact on arms exports. And this also coincides with the fact that arms again are being seen as more of a commercial commodity, right? And the problem with that is that when you do that, you're essentially saying that, oh, well, I need my firm to export arms because I need to keep jobs and I need to keep money flowing, irrespective of the damage that those arms actually cause. What Lawrence also finds is that second tier suppliers are beginning to provide low to mid level technological armaments. And this kind of goes back to the Bitzinger book that we read a couple weeks ago or lectures ago, where Bitzinger talked about this brave new arms industry and talked about that arms were becoming so expensive that the major nations who were able to afford the research and development in arms were actually outsourcing the production. And we're kind of seeing the beginnings of that during this period where these second tier arms suppliers are beginning to provide the parts and the components for these end systems being researched, developed, and produced within first tier arms supplier nations. Lawrence also finds that recipients begin to have a lack of capital to purchase arms. So you're also going into a time period in which that larger influx of petrodollars is kind of beginning to be controlled again. Nations don't necessarily have as much money to spend on arms. And as the bipolar rivalry begins to lower, you see states in Europe and the US kind of begin to shift their military expenditure downward a tad bit. There's not as much heat. They don't necessarily have to spend as much money. And if they aren't spending as much money on military expenditure, it means they don't have the cash to actually go out and buy arms, which also leads to a lack of capital to even purchase those arms. If the military doesn't have the money, they obviously can't buy. So, what does Lawrence have to say about the structure and stratification at this period of time? Well, Lawrence first finds that there's an overall decline in global arms sales. We also have to take a look at this in kind of the light of the bipolar rivalry. At this point in time, Russia and the US, the rivalry between the two isn't as hot. Now, the effect of that is that a lot of the countries in Europe which have these larger defense budgets are lowering military expenditure because they don't necessarily see the need to keep arming themselves for this great Russian threat. We also begin to have the breakup of certain states within the Soviet Union as well, which shows that the big Russian power that was on which was on Europe's doorstep is kind of no longer there or not as much of a threat. So domestic procurement within those nations is going down. Lawrence also finds that the suppliers and recipients are beginning to level out. Part of the reason for that is because there is this lowering of military expenditure throughout the globe, which means that there's just going to be less demand for arms within the system. But also, a reason is that arms at this period of time are becoming much more technologically advanced. So, in the 70s, if you remember during the last phase, a lot of these developing nations were beginning to get capacity to at least build some of these lower tech arms, like, you take a tank or small arms, things like that. But during this period of time, so much technology is being crammed into every primary military system that it's becoming incredibly expensive. A tank is no longer just a tank now. It's basically a computer on wheels, and the same thing with planes. So these developing nations are really beginning to kind of drop out, or at least not participate as actively in the arms export market, because their arms, which are lower tech, aren't as in demand as the arms being produced by many of the primary first tier armed states. Most of the sales during this period are still to developing nations, primarily dominated by conflicts within the Middle East. Lawrence also finds that the arms market is moving from a supplier market to more of a buyer's market due to decreased domestic procurement budgets in major suppliers. So even large major suppliers like the US and Great Britain and even Russia to a certain extent, because there isn't as big of a threat as of superpower conflict, those domestic procurement budgets lower, which means that those firms, those arms producing firms within those states have to look to exports to be able to make up that money. So you see this large influx of suppliers out there trying to get money because there's lower military expenditure. So competition increases dramatically, which really creates a buyer's market. And we'll kind of go into the effects of that here in just a tad bit. Again, conflicts in the Middle East tend to dominate demand. We have the Iran Iraq conflict, which is one of the largest conflicts during this period of time, that's really creating a huge amount of demand within the arms transfer system. Not enough to make up for this overall decline in arms sales, but because this conflict lasts for so long, because both these countries are very rich, almost every supplier around the globe that can produce arms is supplying this conflict. We also again see a significant proliferation of high tech weaponry to developing nations. Again, because it's a buyer's market, many of these countries, like the US, like France, in order to be competitive, are almost forced to export some of their newest, most advanced stuff. So you do see this significant proliferation of high tech arms throughout the world. Now, what are the modes of interaction during this period of time? Well, first, Lawrence finds that arms trade is more commercial in nature. Because it is a buyer's market, because there's so much competition going on, states are trying to export at all costs in order to keep their own domestic defense industries running. So they're beginning to perceive the trade in arms as more a commercial commodity than a commodity that probably shouldn't be treated like exporting reams of paper, right? But because there's so much competition, they're almost forced to do that. You're also seeing a internationalization of production. So now you're seeing these second-tier arms suppliers, these third-tier arms suppliers supply parts and components for systems that are being researched and developed in these first-tier arms supplier nations. You also see that there's a negotiation for arms transfers becoming multilateral within scope. So a state may essentially deal with multiple suppliers if they do want an arms deal. So you're seeing that states are beginning to pair with other states to make their arms sales more lucrative for any type of importing state. And we also see that the illegal arms trade returns to the system at this period of time, especially as the dissolution of the Soviet Union becomes closer and closer and closer. They don't have enough money, so the average person, if you've ever seen the movie Lord of War, it kind of speaks to this. If you had access to arms, you might sell some arms in order to make some money for yourself because the military isn't paying you or the government isn't making sure your checks are coming in on time. So you do see a rise in the illicit arms trade during this period of time. Now, looking at the regime norms and rules during this period, first, Lawrence finds that as far as conflict goes, suppliers aren't able to control conflict with transfer policy. Part of the reason for this is the fact that there's so much competition on the arms export market. Therefore, a state that may be participating in conflict is able to choose from a number of suppliers, which means that no one supplier can really control or coerce the recipient by curtailing arms shipments. And we really see that during the Iran-Iraq conflict. Almost every state that can export arms is exporting to this particular conflict, even though everybody knows that it's an incredibly brutal, bloody conflict. The larger powers are not able to control it with arms transfer policy because they have so many different places to buy arms from. It doesn't matter if the US stops shipping. It doesn't matter if Russia stops shipping. They can just find somebody else to buy their arms from. Lawrence also finds that recipient states are now acquiring arms directly to confront major powers. So you're seeing states getting arms and then confronting these larger major powers. So we see this during the Gulf War, right? Iraq, who imported all these advanced arms, openly used those arms to confront the U.S. So you're seeing that type of activity, which wasn't seen prior. As far as foreign policy and diplomacy is concerned, Lawrence finds that arms transfers are not a reliable method of securing political alignment and are decreasingly used by supplier states for this purpose. Because there's so many suppliers of arms out there, foreign policy, as far as arms transfer goes, can't be used as a tool of leverage as much now. So, and we even see this with today's arms transfer policy. You might hear policymakers talk about using arms as leverage, but it's pretty much the US government and other governments around the globe have acquiesced that it's very difficult to use arms transfers as a tool of coercion now. We try to do it every once in a while. It almost never works, but we still do use arms as kind of that carrot, kind of that incentive to do what we kind of want you to do. But it's definitely not a very good tool of coercion now. And we really start to see it drop during this time period with so many suppliers out there. As far as economic effects go, Lawrence finds that declining military expenditure is forcing states to aggressively pursue exports. So there's not a lot of money out there. The domestic procurement within Europe is going down. So firms within those states, especially those larger prime states like France, Britain, the US, are almost being forced to find export partners in order to keep the money flowing and keep their employment and their production up. Lawrence also finds that demand is still high for arms, but cash is limited. So we find that credit and offset arrangements become popular. So offset arrangements, again, we see really the huge rise in use of offsets at this period of time, but we also see the use of credit being utilized too. So yes, the states within the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, are still using cash, but many of your other nations just don't have enough money to buy these larger, more expensive arms. So they turn towards the use of offsets to try to offset that cost, as well as asking for credit. Now, as far as arms trade control goes, arms control regimes focus on inhibiting developing nations from acquiring significant military capabilities such as ballistic missiles. However, the conventional arms trade remains the norm. So we do see these larger these arms control regimes come up trying to inhibit developing nations from being able to produce advanced arms. Those are really coming into force because for those large first tier states, it behooves them to make sure that these developing nations do not have the military capacity to confront them. The US does not want some developing nation having the ability, like North Korea now has, to use nuclear weapons or have the military capacity to take on a first tier state. So now it behooves first tier states to kind of start to implement or at least agree to these multilateral arms control regimes. But we see that they only really curtail developing nations, which aren't huge customers for conventional arms anyway. And most of these controls have to do with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons as well as missile technology, which still doesn't fully affect the trade in conventional arms. So that doesn't inhibit the states from trying to import planes or tanks. It just inhibits them from building or having the capacity to build these larger conventional arms.